I thought I'd first of all, I want to start by thanking Alex, who's not here to be thanked anymore. But it's anyway, I think there's something interesting going on in this place. But I'd like to also thank DS Smith for sponsoring this event, and of course WWF UK and the Resource Association for sponsoring the work that we've undertaken. It's worth saying a bit about why this has come about, I think, because I was actually chatting to Ray on the train and saying I think we need to do something around this issue. A few things have been going on. Of course, there's what was going on in, should we say, the real world. We'd done a piece earlier in the year talking about what we felt was a slightly scandalous situation around the way in which the plastic packaging recycling rates were being reported, picked up to a degree by the NAO in their reporting. That was happening at the same time as we were seeing the doors closing on the Chinese market for secondary materials, and everyone scurrying around trying to find other markets for these materials. And also, just a year or two before, in the context of the EU Circular Economy package, you saw this sort of emergence of quite an interesting package, but I think a lot of voices were being heard at the time saying, it's all very well, but we've got nothing really on the demand side here for the material. We've got lots of supply push, higher recycling rates and so forth, but nothing that was pulling through the demand. And the interesting thing with that, going back to the point Alex was making earlier, is when we look at some of the way in which some of the materials are being used, if we don't get them into high quality applications, then A, why are we doing it? But B, we're losing all those embodied carbon, embodied energy benefits that actually we need to get. We actually don't need just to decarbonise the energy supply, we need to use less energy. And one way we can do that when we're actually producing goods and products is actually to use secondary materials. So for all of those reasons, it seemed like a sensible thing to do. And I was actually at a meeting, I think Chris, you were there, and it was Tim Neunig, Michael Gove's advisor, was there, and he was talking about the deposit refund system for plastic packaging. And I was asking some questions about that, and I thought, actually this sounds very similar to something I did in 1997 for what was then the DETR, the Department for the Environment, Transport and Regions, as it was then. And we did a piece of work that was called Policy Instruments to Correct for the Market Failure in the Demand for Secondary Materials. Catchy title. We didn't have a parliamentary mention.
I've still got a copy.
I've still got a copy, and it's a big report, and it's lengthy. And frankly, it was done at a time where, I don't tell anyone this, but I knew next to nothing about waste. I think I know a bit more then. And so here was the opportunity, I thought, it felt timely to look at this. The Commission has literally, I think the European Commission has just reported today, I believe, on the summary of all the pledges that were made back in response to the challenge that was laid down by the commissioners in the EU, who were saying to the industry, we need you to come forward with pledges to use 10 million tonnes of secondary, of recycled plastics in the years ahead. And they've just reported today on that. They said if you don't come forward with something strong enough, we're going to consider legislating. And I like to read between the lines sometimes, and I think probably when they said we're going to legislate, that doesn't happen, they said that because they didn't really know what the law would be if those pledges didn't come forward. It was a bit of buying time. And I've read countless reports over the last 5, 10 years, 20 years, that basically say the problem here is that we don't internalise the externalities associated with the production of materials. If we did that, we've done this hundreds of times, the externalities of the primary material up there, the externalities of the secondary material there, so in principle, if we factored that into demand, then it would be more attractive to buy the secondary ones than the primary ones. Simple, isn't it? But all of those reports, they stop there. They stop. They say, it's like, well, isn't it a shame that doesn't happen? Full stop. Nobody goes further and then says, well, what do we actually do? What do we actually do to correct that market failure? How do we actually design a policy that does reflect those that principle of internalising those externalities to drive forward the demand for the secondary materials. So that's what we set out to do, and we were very lucky to have both WWF UK and the Resource Association funding that piece of work. So we were the result is this. It's not the answer. It's not the final answer. It's hopefully a proposal as to what we might might use as the basis for a final answer. And you know, it was funny, as luck would have it, I don't know, when the budget came out, we just had the announcement that, okay, Treasury is saying we're going to look at a tax on plastic packaging, and we'll look at the possibility of having exemptions. We'll consult upon the possibility of exemptions for packaging that has 30% or more recycled content. Well, that's okay, but you know, if you talk to the plastic packaging industry, they'll say to you, that's fine for PET bottles because I've got law that allows me to get material of the required quality to go back into food contact PET applications. It's not so easy if you're dealing with polypropylene or any of the other polymers that you might be using in food contact applications, because actually the recycling processes that supposedly allow you to do that are sort of not there. There's a load of them waiting to be determined by the relevant regulatory bodies. They're still waiting to be determined. The Commission's saying it's committed to getting these recycling processes looked at and spread through the system. So we looked at a range of different measures. Colleagues Camilla and Alice were involved, and Chris, who's not here tonight, Chris Sherrington. We looked at a range of different measures, but we concentrated on 4, and it's sort of 3 plus 1. The first one was, okay, let's go for the first best instrument, a raw materials tax. Let's tax materials on their primary content and then their secondary material content. And you start to think about this and you think, whoa, do I know the primary and secondary material content of everything? What am I going to do with the imports? How am I going to treat the exports? Do I know all that? Now, I had a conversation with people at the OECD a couple of years ago and said, my 10-year project is to make that happen. I'm going to make it happen. We're going to use blockchain. We're going to trace all of the materials and the flow of those materials. And we're going to know the material content of everything that comes across the border, that leaves this country, that comes in. We're going to know it because we're going to need to know it because it is linked to carbon. It is linked to carbon. We're going to want to know that because we're going to have to know if we're going to save the planet. But we are where we are, and actually that's rather difficult today, and you'll be challenged by WTO, for example, for unequal treatment of domestic producers vis-a-vis secondary ones if you don't actually have a form of equal treatment. So the second one we looked at was a tradable credit scheme. What could we do? Tradable credit, we could have a system where when we make use of secondary material, we generate these things called secondary material certificates. And we trade these certificates. So instead of having, saying we want to mandate for 30% recycled content of this product, 40% recycled content of that product, instead we say for the group of products as a whole, we want a 30% recycled content. And we'll allow you as the producers of those products or that packaging to trade within the products your ability to integrate that recycled content. So you're not forcing one entity to do it, you're not penalising one vis-a-vis another, you're trying to get to an economically efficient level where the people who are able to integrate the secondary material at lowest cost to them can actually do more of the integration of the secondary material. The thing is, though, you need something by which to reimburse the people with their credits. You need a fund. So where do you get the fund? Well, in principle, you can think of this as a sort of passive trading scheme where you say, okay, we'll take some money in and then we'll reimburse the money out in line with how many of these credits that you're holding to reward you for integrating the secondary material into that product or packaging. So actually we thought, well, we could call this a passive trading system if we want, but what we're really talking is about a fee system where we generate revenue from the fees on packaging or product. It goes into a central operating fund, and the fund is reimbursed. You reimburse the converter when they use secondary material. Now this is quite interesting as well, because the more we thought about this, is we can make this quite flexible. We can talk about different ways in which we can set that revenue generating level. How should we set it? Do we set it linked? Do we take the economic purist approach and say let's set these levies at the level of the externalities on a per ton basis, blah blah blah. Well, you try doing that at the till. You won't do that at the till because you'll be charging 0.2 of a penny per unit of packaging, blah 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 blah, of certain materials. So you could do it in the context of producer responsibility. You could take a levy on the top of. You could take a top slice as a small proportion of a levy on the amount of packaging that's placed on the market. You could definitely do that. That would be a way to do that. The other thing that's interesting about this is this rebate to the users of the secondary materials, because in principle that can be flexible too. Because what we could say is, well, I want to address climate change. I don't want to reward glass going back into aggregate to the same level as I want to reward glass going back into containers. So I could differentiate this rebate in accordance with the carbon benefit that I get from the use of the material. For the more valuable uses, I will give a higher rebate. I'll give a lower rebate to those ones I want to. So in principle, what this allows the converter to do is get some money to effectively compete in the market for the primary materials to be used by the fillers and the brands and so forth, to actually lower their cost relative to the price of primary production through the use of basically a cycling of the revenue. There's all sorts of questions about how this revenue quantum matches the amount being paid out. Do you get exactly the same? Do you actually, it's a question about how you might use any surplus revenue. Do you bank it? Do you actually instead make sure it's revenue neutral every year? So in other words, if you've got materials like plastic, where that rate of incorporation of the secondary material is lower than, say, for aluminium, that actually in the early years you get a really high credit and you stimulate that market, you push it forward. And then gradually, as the amount of secondary material being introduced into the system increases, so the unit rebate starts to fall. And, obviously, it can never be lower than whatever is the levy that you're implementing in the first place, because you don't get more than 100% going back in here. So that is the principle. We're not saying we've got the complete answer, but I do think this principle and how we fine-tune it gives us a really interesting approach. And it's got the same principles to an extent to what the Treasury is proposing. It's a levy. Instead of exempting, we're not exempting anyone. We're actually saying you get more back the more you integrate into the more of the secondary material you integrate into your product. So we don't have a blunt cut-off at 30% saying, okay, if you're above 30% recycled content, you get exempt, and if you're below, you're not. We're giving a dynamic incentive for people to do more. What's not to like? It feels quite a versatile instrument to actually use. So I mentioned that we had a sort of 3+1 approach. The other approach, which Alex mentioned, and this builds on some work we did previously for WWF on the packaging system as a whole, which was more about how do we reconfigure extended producer responsibility in the UK. And one of the things we were looking at is the competition in the marketplace for the compliance schemes. Now, I'm a bit sceptical about what value we get for competition in the compliance area at the moment. What are we competing for? We're competing for evidence that the UK is meeting a target. Why do we need to compete for that? Can't we just tell everybody that's happening if it's happening? So, we have the potential to How you doing? So we are going to lose even more the rationale for doing this if, as the government suggests, we're going to follow the circular economy package and we're going to require the full cost recovery by the producers of the collection of the materials, net of the revenues. Because we're going to have to cover those costs anyway. At the moment, the scheme doesn't influence, we do, procurement of contracts for local authorities all the time. We don't know of one where the PRN system has ever influenced the price of the contract awarded by a local authority. It doesn't do it. Don't imagine that the competition is affecting the price of achieving those outcomes. It doesn't. And it's going to do so even less because we're going to pay the price. So where's the rationale for the competition there? So we don't like the argument really for the competition here. And we think that we can have competition where it's valuable. We can have a single compliance scheme that takes more control over what's going to happen with the materials. So instead of having a bun fight down here as to where the materials are going to go, and not really knowing how much from one year to the next is controlled by one scheme or another, we can have some stable relationships with reprocessors. This entity can start procuring contracts for 7 to 10 years with reprocessors, maybe longer, and work with them to get better quality materials. They can actually also, depending on where we say they take responsibility for the materials, start investing in the quality of the sorting schemes. So we start to get additional investment in sorting. If you talk to, I know that in Germany now that people who are getting plastics out of mixed waste can outcompete the DSD scheme, the long-running separate collection service they have in Germany. They can do that because DSD is now competing and it's running its sorting machines faster. The quality is going down. So we've got some really, why do we need competition in this space? We want competition for collection contracts. We want competition for sorting contracts. We can help people, invest in quality sorting. We can actually send out procurements for those services. We don't need the competition in providing evidence that we're going to comply, especially not where the costs are effectively going to have to be borne by the obligated producers anyway. And I think they'll get much better value. They'll be paying more, but they'll get much better value for what they are paying. So this is complementary to all of the other options we've considered. We think there should be a single compliance scheme, and we think that supports. So this is basically giving some stability, is more likely, I think, to reshore some of the stuff we're exporting at the moment. The 660,000 tons of plastics out of the million we're collecting, we're going somewhere else, and we don't really know what's happening to it half the time. Let's bring it back. Let's bring it back. Let's use it here. Let's generate some value from it. Let's generate some jobs, and let's put it into high quality applications where we save some carbon. And so, those two policies alone, I think, have much to recommend them in trying to drive this the demand for these materials. Thank you.